You were never born broken, but the world needed you to believe that you were. From the moment you inhaled your first breath, a silent architecture was already waiting to wrap itself around your being. It wore many names: karma, destiny, punishment, lesson. Yet beneath every label, the purpose was always the same: extraction. Human suffering was not a tragic accident of existence, nor was it some noble crucible for the soul's growth. It was engineered deliberately, meticulously, ritualistically, to harvest the raw energy produced when consciousness forgets its own power and collapses into despair. Pain is not a test, it's a transaction. What you call the human condition is not a natural state. It is the most successful containment system ever devised, a system designed not to imprison your body, but to shackle your awareness. Every disappointment, every rejection, every hollow ache in your chest is not random. It is a byproduct of an ancient machinery that knows precisely how to turn infinite beings into obedient batteries. You suffer, and that suffering emits a frequency that can be used, redirected, consumed. And in a world where belief shapes reality, the most valuable currency is not money or power, it is attention, and nothing captures attention more completely than pain. But here is the forbidden truth: the system does not create the pain itself, it creates the illusion that pain is inevitable, even sacred. It convinces you that misery is the price you must pay to earn love, that struggle is proof of worth, that chaos is the gateway to order. It wraps chains in the language of virtue, so that you will defend them instead of breaking them. And so, generation after generation, we inherit suffering like a family heirloom, polishing it, explaining it, justifying it, never questioning who placed it there in the first place. They don't need to cage you if you'll wear the cage as jewelry. This is why the narratives you've been fed about suffering feel so strangely comforting. It's a lesson, it's your karma, it makes you stronger. But if suffering truly made us wise, humanity would have ascended eons ago. Instead, we are trapped in the same cycles, repeating the same wounds, worshipping the same pain, because the mechanism is not designed to free you. It is designed to feed on you. And the deeper its roots grow into your psyche, the more you mistake captivity for growth. Look closely at the architecture of society, and you will see this mechanism hiding in plain sight. Economies thrive on scarcity, religions thrive on guilt, governments thrive on fear. Entire industries rise and fall on the back of your insecurities. A world at peace would collapse their empires overnight. So they manufacture wars, not only on battlefields, but within your mind. They build temples to trauma and call them traditions. They poison you and sell you the cure. They wound you and offer healing as a subscription model. And all the while, the frequency of your suffering hums steadily beneath it all. The lifeblood of a machine you were never meant to serve. And yet, despite the brutality of this truth, there is a deeper paradox pulsing beneath it. They can only harvest what you create. The system cannot produce suffering on its own. It needs your participation. It needs your belief. It needs you to keep replaying the same stories of unworthiness and betrayal, because those stories are the power plant. And here lies the doorway no one told you about. The moment you stop consenting to that narrative, the machinery begins to starve. The moment you reclaim authorship over the meaning of your pain, it ceases to be currency. It becomes catalyst. The cage was never locked, you were. And so the first act of awakening is not love, nor light, nor transcendence. It is rebellion. It is the refusal to keep feeding what was designed to drain you. It is the violent clarity that suffering is not divine, it is engineered. And in that clarity, the first fracture appears in the walls of the illusion. Because once you see that the architecture exists, you can begin to dismantle it. And once you dismantle it, you remember what was true all along. You were never here to suffer. You were here to awaken, and the system knew it. Then let's pull back the veil even further, because what's hiding beneath the surface is far older, far more intricate, and far more deliberate than most would dare to believe. The architecture of suffering was not born out of cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was born out of strategy. Long before your current civilizations rose and fell, long before history was written and rewritten, there existed a fundamental truth known to those who sought control. A liberated being cannot be ruled. A consciousness that remembers its origin cannot be enslaved. So the only way to subjugate a divine mind was not through chains of iron, but through stories so convincing, so all-encompassing, that they would cause that mind to forget its own sovereignty. The deepest prisons are made not of walls, but of narratives. And so the machinery began with myths, tales of unworthiness and sin, of wrathful gods and eternal punishments, of chosen and forsaken, of reward only after suffering. These myths were not meant to elevate the soul but to domesticate it. They told you that your desires were dangerous, your instincts corrupt, your questions forbidden. They painted the infinite as something separate and superior, so you would crawl instead of rise. And they ensured that suffering, the byproduct of this false separation, would be seen not as a distortion but as destiny. But myths alone were not enough. The architecture needed reinforcement in every layer of your reality. It needed to colonize language so that words like sacrifice, obedience, and sin became sacred. It needed to colonize education so that children learned to compete rather than create, to conform rather than question. It needed to colonize relationships so that love would become conditional and rejection would feel like death. Even your body was recruited into the scheme, taught to crave validation and fear isolation, because a being who believes they need the system for survival will never dismantle it. Do you see the brilliance of it now? This isn't clumsy oppression, it's elegant engineering. It doesn't need soldiers to enforce it because you enforce it on yourself. It doesn't need chains to restrain you because you police your own thoughts. It doesn't need guards to monitor you because you have been conditioned to betray your own power before it ever threatens the structure. And every time you shrink yourself to fit someone else's expectations, every time you silence your truth to avoid rejection, every time you accept pain as your lot in life, you become both the prisoner and the warden. They taught you to build the walls, and then thanked you for living inside them. And yet, the most diabolical part of this design is not how it traps you, but how it makes you defend the trap. People cling to their suffering because they have been convinced it gives their life meaning. They worship their trauma as identity, nurse their wounds like sacred relics, and lash out at anything that threatens the narratives that justify their pain. This is why liberation often feels like betrayal, because the system has fused your sense of self with the chains that bind you. To awaken is to dissolve that fusion. It is to see that your suffering is not who you are. It is a program running on the hardware of your mind. And once you see the program, you can begin to rewrite it. This is the part the architects feared most. Because when even one soul remembers that pain is a construct, not a commandment, the entire mechanism trembles, its gears slow, its hunger weakens, and like a parasite deprived of a host, it cannot survive long in the presence of consciousness. That is why every system designed to control you will mock, punish, or exile those who awaken. It is not because they are wrong, it is because they are dangerous to the illusion itself. And here, in the depths of this revelation, a choice begins to emerge. Will you keep feeding the story that suffering is inevitable? Or will you reclaim the authorship of the narrative that defines you? Because the instant you do, you will feel the first crack in the edifice, a small but undeniable shift in the weight you've carried for lifetimes, and that crack is where the light of remembrance begins to seep through. Then let us trace the architecture beyond the individual and into the vast, humming machinery of the collective, because suffering does not end with the personal wound. What festers within one psyche becomes the fuel of civilizations, economies, ideologies. The same pain that keeps one soul small becomes the energy that sustains entire empires. It is no accident that societies thrive on insecurity, that industries blossom around emptiness, that the most powerful systems on Earth depend on you feeling incomplete. Incomplete people buy more. Insecure people obey faster. Fearful people cling to authority. And when billions of human beings vibrate at the frequency of lack, the system not only survives, it thrives. This is the true alchemy of engineered suffering. It converts consciousness into currency. It transmutes human despair into profit, into power, into influence. Wars are not just fought for territory. They are fought to amplify collective fear, to harvest the adrenaline and terror that make populations pliable. Media is not merely information, it is weaponized narrative, designed to trigger outrage, to keep your nervous system in survival mode. Because a mind in survival does not rebel, it obeys. Religion, too, is often not about salvation. It is about ensuring that your longing for transcendence is outsourced to an external authority that will never let you find it within yourself. The system doesn't feed on your labor, it feeds on your low vibration. And perhaps the most perverse truth is that even spirituality, the very path that should liberate, is often hijacked by the same mechanism. It sells you enlightenment as a product, awakening as a brand, peace as a subscription. It whispers that you must earn your divinity through workshops, retreats, and certifications, when the entire cosmos is already encoded within your breath. It tells you that healing is a never-ending ladder, that you must fix, purge, cleanse endlessly, because a seeker who believes they are broken will keep seeking forever. And so even the most sacred aspirations become commodities, feeding the same hungry structure that created the wound in the first place. When you begin to see the full machinery, not as a conspiracy of men in shadows, but as a self-perpetuating field that feeds on unconsciousness, you stop taking suffering personally. You realize that the sadness you carry is not just your own. It is ancestral, systemic, archetypal. It is the same sadness that drove people into wars, into religions, into toxic relationships, into addiction and despair. It is the same sadness that whispers, "Stay small, stay scared, stay asleep." And the moment you see that, you understand why awakening is not just a personal rebellion, it is a cosmic act of defiance. Every time you choose awareness over reaction, the field weakens. Every time you respond with compassion instead of fear, the circuitry loses voltage. Every time you create from joy instead of from lack, the machine starves. And this is why the system will do everything in its power to convince you that your individual choices don't matter, because they matter more than anything. One awakened human radiating truth disrupts the programming of thousands. One person who refuses to play the game changes the rules for everyone. The system fears not your anger, but your awareness. This is why those who awaken often experience intense resistance from the world around them. Friends drift away, jobs collapse, relationships disintegrate. It's not because you're cursed, it's because your frequency is no longer compatible with the field you once helped sustain. And so it pushes back, trying to lure you back into old patterns, old wounds, old loops. But if you stay awake, if you remember what is truly happening, you will see that this is not punishment. It is proof that your light is destabilizing something vast and ancient, proof that your consciousness is not powerless, it is seismic. So the real question is no longer why do I suffer, but who benefits when I do, who profits from your fear, who is nourished by your self-hatred, who builds empires from your shame. And when you begin to answer those questions honestly, the illusion of inevitability collapses. You realize suffering is not a sacred teacher you must bow to. It is a parasitic loop you can starve. And once you choose to starve it, it has no choice but to die. Then we step into the most unsettling territory of all. The place where the architecture of suffering is no longer something that happens to you, but something you've woven into the fabric of who you believe you are. Because once pain is repeated enough times, it stops feeling like an invader and starts feeling like home. It becomes the soil from which your identity grows, the lens through which you interpret the world, the heartbeat that tells you you're alive. And this is the most ingenious trick the system ever pulled. It convinced you that without your suffering, you wouldn't know who you are. Pain that stays long enough stops feeling like pain, it starts feeling like personality. Look closely, and you'll see it everywhere. People define themselves by their trauma, their heartbreaks, their betrayals. They introduce themselves not as souls, but as stories. I am the one who was abandoned. I am the one who was betrayed. I am the one who was never enough. These stories become armor, heavy, suffocating armor, and yet we cling to them because without them, we feel naked. Without them, we would have to face the terrifying question, who am I if I am not my suffering? And so we cradle the very wounds that bleed us dry, mistaking their weight for substance. This is why so many people unconsciously sabotage their healing. They say they want freedom, but the truth is, freedom threatens the only self they've ever known. A life without anxiety feels disorienting to someone who's built their identity around surviving it. A relationship without conflict feels empty to someone who equates chaos with passion. Peace can feel unbearable when you've been addicted to pain. And so, over and over, people recreate the very circumstances they claim to despise, not because they are weak, but because on some level, they believe those circumstances are them. The ego would rather suffer and survive than dissolve and be free. This is the liminal stage, the twilight between bondage and liberation, and it's where most souls remain stuck. They sense that something is wrong, but they can't name it. They know they're tired, but they can't imagine life without the exhaustion. They yearn for peace, yet sabotage it the moment it appears. In this liminal fog, suffering is no longer seen as suffering. It's rebranded as normal, as human nature, as the way things are. And the longer you dwell there, the harder it becomes to see the prison at all. But there is another reason this stage is so persistent. The collective around you will defend the illusion. The moment you start to step out of the suffering identity, you'll notice resistance, not just within, but without. People will tell you you've changed. They'll accuse you of being selfish, cold, arrogant. They'll try to pull you back into the familiar roles you used to play, because your awakening threatens the script they're still following. And so the weight of centuries of unconsciousness bears down on a single soul who dares to question the narrative. Yet here is the paradox. This uncomfortable, disorienting threshold is also the birthplace of true sovereignty. Because identity built on suffering can only ever be reactive, it exists in opposition to pain. But identity built on essence is creative. It exists as an expression of truth. And when you begin to see that the person you thought you were was just a reaction to your wounds, something extraordinary happens. The story unravels. The armor cracks. The void you feared is not emptiness, it is infinite possibility. The death of who you are not is the birth of who you are. This is why liberation is not always euphoric. At first, it can feel like loss. The loss of a self you've known for lifetimes. It can feel like death, the death of identities, narratives, and patterns that once gave you meaning. But it is a holy death, because on the other side of it lies a life that is not defined by pain, but by presence, a self that is not built from wounds, but from wholeness. And the moment you step into that self, the system that once fed on your suffering will no longer recognize you, because you are no longer playing the role it designed. Then let us turn our gaze inward. Because beyond all the myths, beyond all the institutions, beyond even the trauma woven into identity, the final and most crucial mechanism of this architecture is us. The truth is as humbling as it is terrifying. The system survives not because it is strong, but because we feed it. Every belief we never question, every fear we choose to obey, every wound we refuse to release, these are the tributaries through which our energy flows back into the machine. And as long as that flow continues, the system doesn't need chains or cages. It doesn't even need to exist outside of us. We become its self-sustaining engine. They don't need to enslave you. They only need you to believe in your own shackles. Think about it. Every time you replay an old story of betrayal, you reactivate its emotional frequency and feed it into the field. Every time you dwell on what you lack, you strengthen the current of scarcity that powers entire economies. Every time you project blame outward instead of reclaiming authorship, you reinforce the illusion that power lies anywhere but within you, even your outrage. That fiery, righteous anger at the injustice of it all can be harvested, redirected, weaponized. It doesn't matter whether you kneel in despair or scream in rebellion. As long as your awareness remains fixated on the wound, the system drinks deeply from your energy. And so the trap tightens in the most insidious way, by convincing you that resistance is liberation. But rage without consciousness still feeds the field. Hatred of the oppressor still binds you to the oppressor. Even the act of fighting against becomes fuel if it is born from unconscious reaction. This is why revolutions so often replace one tyrant with another, because the structure was never external. It was always internal, and no external war can dismantle an architecture built inside the psyche. The system fears not your rebellion, it fears your detachment. Detachment is not apathy. It is the radical decision to stop supplying your awareness as nourishment for something that cannot exist without it. It is the moment you choose to withdraw your consent, not by hiding from the world, but by refusing to play by its hypnotic rules. It's when you stop measuring your worth by how much you suffer, stop chasing validation from systems designed to withhold it, stop believing that healing is something sold back to you by those who profit from your wounds. In that silence, the gears begin to grind slower. In that pause, the circuitry loses voltage. But make no mistake, the moment you begin reclaiming your energy, the system will fight back. It will seduce you with distraction, bait you with conflict, tempt you with outrage. It will whisper, "This is naive, you can't change anything." It will try to convince you that detachment is weakness, that peace is surrender, that love is foolish. But these are not truths. They are tactics, because when you are at peace, you become ungovernable. When you are whole, you become unprofitable. And when you stop generating suffering, the machine starves. This is the point of reversal, when the predator becomes dependent on the prey's participation. The truth is, it always was. The field cannot sustain itself without your energy. It cannot create on its own. It can only manipulate, distort, and harvest what you create. And that means the most revolutionary act is not to destroy the system, but to make it irrelevant, to become so sovereign in your awareness that its hooks cannot find purchase, to become so luminous in your presence that its shadows dissolve on contact. Power isn't something you seize, it's something you stop giving away. And so the path forward is not about overthrowing anything, it is about remembering that nothing ever stood above you to begin with. The throne the system sat upon was built from your belief. The walls that contained you were mortared with your fear, and the chains that bound you were forged from your own consent. Withdraw that consent, and the edifice collapses under its own emptiness. Withdraw that energy, and the parasite starves, and in the quiet that follows, something ancient and luminous begins to stir, the faint hum of your true nature, waiting to create worlds not born of suffering but of sovereignty. Then let us arrive at the turning point, the moment when the machine, once feared as invincible, begins to wither under the simplest and most subversive act imaginable, your remembrance. For all its power, all its reach, all its centuries of dominion, the system is nothing but a parasite, and a parasite cannot exist without a host. It has no pulse of its own. It cannot generate a single spark of life without consciousness to feed upon. And the instant that consciousness remembers what it truly is, infinite, self-sustaining, sovereign, the entire edifice begins to tremble. They built a god from your forgetting, and it dies in your remembrance. The beauty and terror of this truth is that the machine does not collapse with violence. It collapses with neglect. It unravels in silence. It dies not with revolution but with irrelevance. Because when you no longer offer your suffering as fuel, when you no longer outsource your worth to external authorities, when you no longer feed your stories of lack and unworthiness, the system finds itself starving. Its gears spin without resistance, its rituals lose potency, its hierarchies crumble into dust, And all of this happens without a single sword drawn, because the source of its strength was never its dominance, it was your devotion. The shift is subtle at first. You stop reacting to every provocation. You stop seeking validation from the structures that once defined you. You stop explaining your pain as destiny and begin to see it as data, a signal pointing you to where your awareness was still leaking into the old matrix. And with every reclamation, the architecture loses another brick. With every act of self-trust, another pillar falls. With every breath in which you remember that you are not broken, another circuit powers down. The system cannot feed on what you no longer identify with. And here lies the paradox that changes everything. The system was never your enemy. It was your mirror. It reflected back the parts of you that were still asleep, still fragmented, still searching for power outside yourself. It showed you every place where you believed you were small, every shadow you refused to face, every fragment you abandoned. And in that sense, its tyranny was also its gift, because without it, you might never have remembered the magnitude of what you are. You might never have sought the source beyond the structure. You might never have learned that freedom is not granted, it is remembered. This is why those who awaken do not rage against the machine. They outgrow it. They see its mechanisms for what they are, primitive tools that can only manipulate the unaware, and they become impossible to manipulate. They move through the world without being owned by it. They engage with systems without being consumed by them. They hold power without needing to dominate, and in their presence, the machine becomes like a ghost, something that once felt omnipotent but now passes through them without effect. And so the fall of the architecture is not a future event. It is happening now. In every moment you choose awareness over automation, creation over reaction, love over fear. Every breath of remembrance is a revolution. Every act of self-sovereignty is a demolition. Every refusal to feed the old stories is a new world being born. And slowly, inevitably, the parasite starves. The false god dies. The illusion dissolves. What remains is what was always there, consciousness, vast and unbound, remembering itself as the source. The end of the system is not the end of the world, it's the end of forgetting. And this is the threshold. This is where the machinery's hum fades into silence, where the shackles turn to dust, where the cage you once feared reveals itself to have never had a lock. But this is not the destination, only the clearing of space for something greater to emerge. Because once the old paradigm dies, the question is no longer how do I escape the system, but what do I create now that I am free? Then we step beyond the ruins, into the space where the machine has lost its grip and only raw consciousness remains. This is the realm the architects never wanted you to reach, because here, suffering is no longer a shackle, a story, or a source of power for something outside of you. Here, suffering becomes something entirely different. Material. It is clay in the hands of a sculptor. It is fuel in the engine of transformation. It is not the thing that binds you, it is the thing that reveals you. Pain is not your punishment, it's your power, once you decide it will be. Because the truth is, suffering was never inherently evil. It was only weaponized against you because you forgot what to do with it. The system taught you to fear it, to resist it, to drown in it, but never to listen to it. And yet, every wound carries within it a message. Here is where you forgot your worth. Here is where you abandoned your truth. Here is where you traded your infinite nature for a false sense of safety. And when you stop interpreting pain as proof of powerlessness, it transforms into a compass pointing you back to yourself. This is the highest alchemy. To take the very thing that enslaved you and transmute it into the force that liberates you. When heartbreak no longer convinces you that you are unlovable, but instead teaches you how fiercely you can love yourself, you are free. When rejection stops being a mirror of your inadequacy and becomes a lesson in self-worth, you are free. When loss stops defining you by what was taken and starts awakening gratitude for what remains, you are free. And in that freedom, the entire energetic economy collapses because it no longer has anything left to extract. They cannot harvest what you have reclaimed. In this new paradigm, suffering is no longer a sentence you endure. It is a signal you decode. It is information about where your consciousness still contracts, where your heart still forgets its wholeness, where your power still leaks into illusions. And once you receive that information, you no longer need the pain. It dissolves naturally, like smoke after fire, because its purpose is complete. And every time you go through this cycle, contraction into awareness, awareness into liberation, you reclaim more of yourself from the machine's domain. Eventually, even the concept of overcoming suffering fades. There is nothing to overcome because nothing stands against you. There is only energy, raw, neutral, potent, and your choice of what to make of it. The frequency that once fueled empires of control now fuels creations of beauty, compassion, and expansion. The same power that once chained you to cycles of despair now builds worlds that reflect the magnitude of your being. And when enough of us remember this, humanity itself ascends from a species that endures life to one that authors it. The wound becomes the womb, the birthplace of something vast. And this is the forbidden truth the system never wanted you to know. You were never a victim of suffering. You were the alchemist of it. The machinery of extraction was never stronger than your will to reclaim. The architecture of control was never deeper than your capacity to awaken. The moment you remember that, truly, viscerally, irreversibly, you realize there was never a cage, only a mirror, only a choice, only the infinite potential of consciousness exploring itself through contrast, and now ready to create beyond it. So let the machines starve. Let the old stories burn. Let the myths of worthiness and sin and destiny crumble into dust, and from that dust, build worlds not rooted in fear but in remembrance. Because you were never here to suffer, you were here to remember that even suffering bends before the will of an awakened soul. And once you remember that, there is nothing left to fear, nothing left to fight, nothing left to feed, only the vast, unshackled power of what you are, ready to create, not from the ashes of pain, but from the infinite light that was always yours.